this week on Q&A. Our guest is Thomas DiLorenzo, author of 2 books on Abraham Lincoln, The Real Lincoln and Lincoln Unmasked.
Thomas DiLorenzo, when did you first get interested in Abraham Lincoln?
Probably in the late 90s when I was a Civil War buff, and I started reading a lot about the Civil War and took courses at the Smithsonian, went on field trips. It was just a hobby of mine, and I'm an economist by training. I'm an economics professor at Loyola College in Baltimore, and I started thinking of how I could combine my profession, economics, with Civil War history, and I thought writing about Lincoln was the way. And I think the economic side of the story of Lincoln and the Civil War has been underdeveloped, undertold, and so that's how I got into it.
Well, in the late 90s, how did you personally at that time feel about Abraham Lincoln? And how much did you know about him?
Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I played baseball at Thaddeus Stevens Middle School, and I remember singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic in elementary school almost every day, and so I was educated like most Americans were about it, and I thought he was the savior of the Union and the man who freed the slaves. But there was always something that sounded kind of fishy about that story to me, even and when I was a school child. And so after I educated myself, I started educating myself some more about it, and I sort of changed my mind, as you know, about Lincoln.
How would you describe your feelings about him today?
Well, I think in some of my writings, I talk about the Church of Lincoln, and he's been deified a great deal. And I think it's a very unhealthy thing for society to deify any politician, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or George Washington even. There's nothing wrong with praising them for the good things they've done, but I think it's dangerous to deify a politician. And I think I mentioned in my writings that politicians of all parties, even the Communist Party USA, have tried to attach their agenda to the martyred Abraham Lincoln, and have used him and his words and his deeds for all sorts of purposes, some good and some not so good. And so I think it's, I don't have a really high opinion. And I guess one of the things that really bothered me when I started looking into this was when I found out that all the other countries of the world that ended slavery in the 19th century did it peacefully, and that included New England and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana, the northern United States. And as an economist, I started thinking, well, why was this not an alternative for America? Why was it only in America where there was a war attached to the ending of slavery? And that's why the subtitle of my first book, The Real Lincoln, includes the words, an unnecessary war. I think it could have been possible for us to do what England and Spain and France and Denmark and other countries did, end slavery peacefully. So what was the purpose? And I've concluded that the purpose of the invasion of the southern states was what Lincoln said it was to destroy the secession movement, and he called it saving the Union. But all the death that was attached to that is the thing that sort of haunts me. That was it really necessary for some 650 million or 650,000 Americans to have died? And if you standardize that to today's population, which is 10 times higher than it was in 1860. You're talking the equivalent of 5 or 6 million people dying, standardizing for a much larger society that we have today. And so that is what really hit me hard of why all that death was necessary just to save the Union. And on top of that, I argue that the Union wasn't saved because the Union was voluntary. The Union of the Founders was voluntary, and it was no longer voluntary after 1865. Well, Lincoln was I call him the political son of Alexander Hamilton in my book. And Hamilton, when he was Treasury Secretary, he advocated essentially bringing the British mercantilist system to America. And this mercantilist system, it's a kind of a tongue twister of a word. It was basically a system of policies that benefited primarily politically connected businesses at the expense of everyone else, at the expense of consumers and other businesses. There were government-sanctioned monopolies in England, for example. There were barriers to international trade. As part of it, there were what we today would call corporate welfare or subsidies to politically favored businesses, and Hamilton favored all of this. And after his death, the mantle for this movement to sort of bring British mercantilism to America fell to the Whig Party and Henry Clay, and then to the Republican Party. And Abraham Lincoln always said that Henry Clay was his political role model. He called him the beau ideal of a statesman in one of his speeches. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons I got interested in writing a book on Lincoln, is that he spent 28 years of his off and on political involvement before becoming president advocating what Henry Clay and Hamilton called the American system of high protectionist tariffs, a central bank run by politicians in the nation's capital, and government subsidies to corporations. And the Whig Party thought this would be the key to perpetual political power. Have a bank that could print money, tariffs that would block competition, so you would have all of the big corporations, mostly in the North, on your side as the Whig Party. And Lincoln picked up that mantle as the Republican nominee and then president. And one of the stories I tell in my book, The Real Lincoln, is that there was a political battle over these economic policies for about 70 years. And the Whigs and the old Federalists of Hamilton's day had very little success in getting any of this done over this time. But it was all put into place during the Lincoln regime. Tariffs went up to 45 to 50% and stayed there until Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913. The central bank, the National Currency Acts that I write about in my writings, that was sort of a resurrection of Hamilton's central banking idea. And of course the railroad subsidies, the big subsidies to the railroad corporations that started during the Civil War and thereafter. And so and Hayek would have been opposed to every bit of that. That's all interventionist, anti-free market, big government economic policy. And so there are a lot of historians who don't understand much about economics, and they look at these things, they tend to judge these policies by the intentions of the people who advocate them. They'll say, well, I think Abraham Lincoln was a great man, he advocated these things, therefore they must have been good ideas. That's essentially the arguments that is made. Well, you can agree that he was a great man and he had good intentions, but these were bad policies nevertheless, I think bad for America. And I think a great tragedy for America, however, is that he used his genius to essentially manipulate the South Carolinians into firing the first shot at Fort Sumter and plunging the whole nation into a war and then invading his own country. After, at Fort Sumter, as I'm sure you know, no one was killed or hurt, but the response was a full-scale invasion of the entire southern states. And so I think he used his genius in a way that, in my latest book, Lincoln Unmasked, I write about how wouldn't it have been great had he used this genius to be more statesmanlike and end slavery peacefully, like the British and the Spaniards did, and then do other things for America, as opposed to a 4-year war that killed 650,000 Americans.
How did he trick the South Carolinians?
Well, he promised he would not send warships to Fort Sumter, certainly, when he did. And then in my book, I quote him a letter from Lincoln to his naval commander, Commander Fox, Gustavus Fox, thanking him for his assistance in getting the outcome that they desired. And the outcome that they desired was getting the South Carolinians to fire on Fort Sumter, because he guessed correctly that the people of the North would rally behind the flag and support the war that he wanted to get into. And at the same time, you had the Confederates had sent peace commissioners to Washington to offer to pay the South's portion of the national debt and to pay for federal forts like Fort Sumter. Napoleon III of France offered to broker some sort of compromise, but Lincoln refused to speak to any of them. He wouldn't see any of them. He was determined to go to war, which he did.